Tech Priest, make it spin.
Spin? Sir, it doesn't spin.
What? It has to spin. It's round. But spinning is so much cooler than not spinning. I'm the general. I want it to spin. Now.
Yes, sir. Look at that.
Nice. First step with all Forge World models, you gotta wash them. Then you have to cut off these giant gates. I typically use a jeweler's saw, it works really well. And then I've decided to cut out a giant portion of the side here where the tank treads on. This is going to be where I'm going to be able to access the battery and any of the other electronics I may need to deal with. And now that that's all done, and I've added some magnets to the side tracks here, it's time to fit the sponson heavy bolters I've gone with. So I'm going to mark out a hole that I can drill into here so I can feed the wires through to get to the inside of the tank. The real key when drilling resin is to go slow and kind of pull chips often. You get these really long stringy bits and you don't want to drill those in very much like I'm totally doing right now. And that brings us on to transferring into the side that I need to drill this into for the actual tank body. I'll need to drill it on one side, but the other one is actually lined up with the hole that I've cut out to get into it, and I'll get to that a little bit later. And I'm going to have to drill these heavy bolters all the way through so I can get the LEDs in there. Resin's a little bit tougher to get through than plastic just because if it catches, it'll snap a lot easier. So going slow and pulling the drill out often to clear chips is definitely key on these smaller pieces. Here's what the heavy stubbers look like before paint. They're actually brass details for an aircraft model. Drilling these out was going to be completely impossible to put LEDs in there, and even then, the LEDs I had to use were literally the smallest ones you can find. So I've put a link in the description, but this is exactly what I've used. The 1/24th scale 131 German cannons. They're really cool. I really like the detail up stuff that you can get. It really brings these models to another level. Unfortunately, they weren't perfect. I'm having to drill out the very tip of them, and then I'm going to cut down the actual barrel and run the wires through the barrel shroud. And because I don't want to actually pin these into the rest of the barrel piece here, I'm actually going to drill this out and use an aluminum tube piece to pin into the barrel. That way I still have a hole all the way through, but I have a nice solid connection into this bit of resin that's then going to go into the rest of the tank. Which brings us to this little turret here. So I'm actually going to bring the drill all the way through, kind of fit it on, and I've marked a place for where I want this to be. I'm going to drill this side all the way out and get the aluminum tube in there before I actually mark and drill the other side. That way I know that both pins will actually fit in nicely, and I can get the wires running through both of them. I do want to mention when cutting tubing, you don't want to squish the tubing, so using a pair of clippers isn't really going to work unless you want to file all the way back past the point where the clippers have squished it. So using a jeweler's saw or a cutoff disc in a Dremel or even a pipe cutter. I know K&S makes a nice little pipe cutter that does teeny tiny pipes. Any of those will work a hell of a lot better than just clipping it off. But that brings us to this point here. And you see I'm actually fitting the very tips of the barrel on here. So just making sure that it looks good and I know what direction I want this to be going because I will be gluing this down. So I also want to make sure that the barrels are straight and even and as parallel as I can get them. So I've soldered two of the 0201 teeny tiny LEDs here and I've put the wires into the tips. Now I'm adding some epoxy with a tiny bit of white pigment in it that'll help diffuse the light a little bit and not make it such a pinpoint of light, even though it's really small anyway. The epoxy will also block any of the electronic connection that might happen between the light and the brass, which apparently I accomplished as you saw in the opening. And I'm going to use epoxy again here to go ahead and glue these tips into the barrel shrouds and kind of fish the wire through one little tiny step at a time. I'm actually adding a little bit of epoxy down the wire a bit as well to kind of get a better joint and also to kind of take some of the stress off of the wire. These wires are really thin, and I really want these wires to stay in place and not break. And I'm going to solder them to a thicker wire pretty much as soon as I can. I'm also keeping this Q-tip handy here just to clean up any excess resin that's coming off the side. First piece all ready to go. LEDs, and I put fiber optics in it for the little targeter piece. All of these wires, I believe I put a resistor in at this point. I don't remember. I think I ended up putting another resistor in anyway. This ended up working really well. The O201 LEDs that I got only had a 10 milliamp rating, so they're half of what normal LEDs are. So that was something I had to keep in mind. For most of this project, I ended up using 5-minute epoxy. That gives me a little bit more working time, and it fills space a little bit better than super glue, which is really good here because I want these wires to be covered in something. So if you end up pulling on them from the inside, you're not ripping them away from the teeny tiny LEDs and making the guns not work anymore. Remember how I said we'd come back to that later? Well, it's later now. This is where we're going to have that other heavy bolter piece coming through on the sponson. I'm putting a JST connection here with a wire that I'm tying a knot into so that I can get a nice good purchase on it, so that if you pull off the track section too fast, this will pop and come off and I can get into there and I won't actually rip out the wires that actually go to the bolter on the other side. So of course that means I have to put a JST connection onto the bolter side. So I'm going to do that now, and I'm doing this pretty much as quick as possible when it comes to the wire's length, because I want as much epoxy resin to solidify that into the hole on the track side there, so that I have a good connection on both sides. So when I'm pulling this apart, it'll just pop and I don't have to worry about anything ripping apart. I'm also on the JST connection, there's the little tension bead, as it were. I'm shaving that off to make the JST come apart really easily. Getting sound on these models is always a bit of a challenge, so I've taken a piece of cardboard and made a little template. As you can see, I've etched it into the bottom here. I'm going to have 2 holes. I'm using 2 speakers, and I'm just going to drill a big fat hole here with a drill, and then I'm going to come in with the jeweler saw to actually get the rest of the cut done. The holes in the bottom of the tank may never be seen, but I'm still going to cover them with some photo etch brass mesh that I got from Green Stuff World. What I'm doing is I'm going to cover this entire square panel at the bottom here. That way it doesn't really break up the look of the bottom and it looks a bit more like it's part of the tank. Again, no one's probably ever going to see this, but it makes me feel better. Moving on to the lights. For the headlights here, I've removed the strut that they're actually supposed to glue onto and replaced it with a brass tube. That way I can actually feed wires through it and it'll pin in a little bit more solidly. Gonna make sure and I test both of these before I go any further, because them not working now would be good to know before I glue them into the main piece. And because they are working, they get to add to this whole mess of wires now coming out of the bottom of my tank. The bottom plate of this tank, before I go any further, I need to cut some holes in it. So I'm cutting a hole here. This is going to be for my main switch. I'm going to cut a hole in the back for the light switch, and then I'm going to drill a hole out for the button. This has 3 different things it can do, basically. I wanted to make sure that I had a main switch that was a little bit fancier than just a slide switch. So this is actually a toggle switch that's going to go into here. And then a slide switch is going in for the light. That way I have 2 different types of switches, so I know which one's which. And of course I have the button to make it do the things. Now the question you've probably been asking this whole time, how did I get these to spin? Well, long story short, I didn't. I just completely cut them off and replaced them with some 3D printed parts. And of course, the best part for me is I designed them, so even in a Games Workshop tournament, it's totally legal. The big reason I 3D designed them myself is I wanted to put them on these step-down gearboxed motors. It has a half-round key at the front of it, and I wanted to make sure that that was going to fit onto the exact motors that I had, because these are actually just going to be pressure fit on here. That way I don't have to worry about the glue seeping into any of the gears or anything else and preventing anything from spinning. And for the 3D printing, I actually went with Shapeways because this 3D printed plastic that they have Although the light shines through it and I have to paint it and fix that problem, it's a little bit more resilient than resin printer, but a little bit of a higher quality than an FDM printer. So whatever they're doing there for these, I really like. So I put these on some masking tape and I spray painted the front of them black, then silver, then black again to block any of the light. And I'm coming in with some masking fluid into the keyholes in the back here. And then I'm going to paint the back in the same way. So black, then silver, then black. And then after that, I'm actually going to paint them silver for the color that I want. But this way I'm getting enough paint on here that the light doesn't shine through the print. Cutting out the original barrels was definitely a process. I used these little saw blades here. I definitely overcut into pretty much both sides here, and I had to go back and green stuff and fix it, but it ended up working out okay. Then I had to find and mark the center point and get a nice little kind of starting point for the drill to drill these out for the motors. Now, I ended up gluing the motors in with some epoxy. And these holes were quite difficult to get straight and to get deep enough because the motors were pretty thick and I had to drill in pretty darn deep. And then I had to make sure everything lined up so I could actually push wires through and make sure that they weren't all cattywampus and swinging the Gatling guns in a weird pattern. Before the motors were placed in, I also drilled a hole right on the top to actually place the LED. Now what you see me doing here is I'm actually taking a piece of the tape that the LEDs come in. They come in these nice black strips with holes in them to kind of align the LEDs so you can do things with that. But what I'm doing with them is I've cut these away and I'm putting them right around the LED so the LED is only shining out of this small hole and only lighting up one barrel at a time. The other thing I had fighting for space here was the fiber optics. You can see the fiber optics coming out the bottom of the turret here. What I did was I actually drilled out the little targeters on top straight out, and then I drilled down and kind of shaved in a little ramp and then came back and green stuffed that over so you won't be able to tell once it's painted. So the turret then got all of the wires fished through and glued onto the top of this tank here. And now I'm working with all the fiber optics. So what I've done is I've taken a big red 5mm LED and I've shaved down the top of it so it's flat instead of having that round tip. I put 2 pieces of shrink wrap over it, one to feed the fiber optic cables into and one to just cover the LED. That way the LED isn't going to shine into the cavity and potentially have light bleed coming out some of the cracks. And also will shine directly into each piece of the fiber optics to make sure that all of those get a nice bright little shine. And now it's time to work on the sound. So I have the soundboard here I'm going to solder some stuff into. The little black piece that you see soldered on top is actually a 5-volt linear regulator that I'm using because the battery power is getting pretty close to 8 volts when the batteries are fully charged, and 8 volts will fry this board. So I want to make sure I step down the voltage to 5 volts so I don't do that. Link here for a more in-depth kind of tutorial on the soundboards themselves. These are from Adafruit. I love them. I use them in all of my sound projects. Now worth mentioning though is on all of these boards there are actually 2 ins and outs for speakers. So you can actually run 2 speakers and you can actually run them in stereo. So I'm actually running them in stereo and I've made the sound different per side for when the guns fire. And here's the bottom, mostly wired up. The switch in the front is going to be my power on and off. The switch near the back is going to be the lights, and the very back here is the button to make it do the shooting sequence. So here I am gathering all of the wires together. In this build, all of the green wires are going to ground, and that red wire that's in the pile is actually the switch wire because the button, when I hit the button, it's going to go to ground for all of the effects to take place, for the sound to trigger as well as for the Arduino. So I'm collecting all of these into a bit of a wire harness and I'm going to solder them all together. Running motors with an Arduino can be an interesting problem, so I've sidestepped that all with this motor driver board. Now you just plug your Arduino into it, it sends the signal, and then it gives the appropriate amount of power to your motor and you don't worry about blowing out your Arduino. So here we're in the final stages of tank surgery, where I'm soldering everything into the Arduino. The 2 little bits that are covered in shrink wrap are the motor driver board and the soundboard. Those are covered in shrink wrap so they don't end up shorting on something else. And you probably notice all of the bits and bobs in this little box that I have here for all the other things that I still need to glue onto this tank to actually finish it. And of course, doing a test run before you glue it together is definitely a good idea. So now we have to stuff all the guts back inside, and the key point here is to make sure that there's still room for the battery. And now that we know that fits as snug as it might be, we can move on to actually gluing this together. So it's time to break out the clamps and the epoxy, and we've got this whole base plate here getting glued together. I use super glue for most of the other bits and bobs, but for the big stuff, I like the extra working time of epoxy. So now that I have the extra treads and the gas tanks and the exhaust pipes and everything else glued on, I'm going to go through, I'm going to tape up all of the switches and the buttons and the speakers. Most of my tanks, oddly enough, I actually leave this blue color on the bottom and I don't camouflage them because they're not seen very often, and let's be honest, if the bottom of the tank is showing, you have other problems. You may notice that I'm not using the classic hatches on this. I'm actually using the Baneblade Command Cupola hatches, which I like a hell of a lot better. And here you can see that green stuff work that I did with the fiber optics at the top of the spinning barrels. Now we come to the detailing parts. So these are some detail up bits that I got from Gundam models. They have a lot of cool different things you can get, and I'm going to put these on the lights for the front and for the side to give it kind of a shutter effect. I'm skipping through all the painting on this. If you guys want to have an actual video on how I do my painting, let me know in the comments and I will work on getting one of those done. But here it is, all done in all its glory. And of course, well, if you made it all the way through that, thanks for sticking around. If you want to see more of my stuff, like and subscribe. I definitely have more of this kind of stuff coming, and I will leave you with this.